What we're told about the free folk is fairly consistent. They don't follow kings in any lasting way. Groups form, split, fight and move on. Even when someone gathers followers, it tends to fall apart once the immediate need passes. So when reports start coming into the Night's Watch about people gathering in large numbers, it doesn't immediately stand out. That kind of movement happens. But this keeps going. More groups arrive, then more, and instead of breaking apart, they stay together. By the time Jon sees the camp in A Storm of Swords, it's already on a scale that doesn't really match what the Watch expects from the people beyond the wall, and that's where the question starts. Hello everyone, and welcome to Storyteller's Codex. Here we delve deep into the rich lore of the Lord of the Rings, a song of ice and fire, and the vast worlds beyond, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. When Jon is brought into Mance Rayder's tent, the setting is almost understated. No guards announcing him, no display of rank beyond how others behave around him. Mance is sitting with a lute, dressed like anyone else in the camp. But the way people respond to him is different. Tormund listens. Styr listens. Even the groups that don't get along still pause when he speaks. There's no formal structure forcing that. It's just something that's settled into place. Jon notices that early on, and when Mance explains why he left the Night's Watch, the story he tells is small. The cloak, patched with red silk, being told to cut it away because it doesn't belong, and doing it, but not forgetting it. He doesn't present it as rebellion. It comes across more like a moment where something stops making sense to him. The Watch has rules that don't bend. Beyond the wall, those rules don't exist unless people choose them. Jon argues from the other side. Duty, vows, the idea that the Watch holds the line. Mance doesn't dismiss that. He lets it stand, then approaches the same point from a different angle, talking about how people live beyond the wall in practical terms rather than ideals. That difference matters. He understands the Watch from the inside, and the free folk from living among them. So when he speaks, he's not limited to one set of assumptions, and that gives him a way of reaching people that others don't really have. When Jon is with the wildlings, what stands out isn't a single story about the others. It's that people are leaving places they normally wouldn't leave. You hear about empty villages, hunting grounds abandoned, groups moving south earlier than they should. Not in a panic exactly, but in a way that suggests something isn't right. Tormund mentions it in passing. Others refer to it without making a point of it. It doesn't come across as a shared explanation, more like a pattern that different people have noticed from their own experience, and that matters. Because the free folk don't tend to respond to distant threats. If something is dangerous, you move away from it. You don't try to solve it on a larger scale, but here movement keeps happening in the same direction. Toward other groups, toward the same gathering. So whatever is driving this isn't just fear. It's something that doesn't go away when you change location, and that creates a situation where the usual way of living, moving, splitting, avoiding, stops working as well as it used to. You can see why that would make space for someone to step in and frame it differently. Not as a series of separate problems, but as one that affects everyone. There isn't a single moment where everyone decides to follow Mance Rayder. Jon never sees that. What he sees instead is the result. Different groups already there when he arrives, more coming in over time, some better organised than others, some clearly uncomfortable being that close to people they would normally fight. The Thenns are there, with their own structure and hierarchy. Tormund's group feels looser. Raiders, hunters, families. They don't all behave the same way, and yet they stay. That's the part Jon keeps noticing. Not that they've come together, but that they don't immediately fall apart again. When he speaks to Mance, there are hints of how it happened. Not in a single explanation, but in fragments. He's travelled widely, met different leaders, spoken to them directly, in some cases fought them, in others reached an understanding. There's a sense that this took time, and that it didn't unfold the same way everywhere. Some people likely joined early, others would have needed convincing, others still may have followed simply because enough people around them already had. By the time Jon sees the camp, that process is already behind them. What's left is maintaining something that doesn't have a natural reason to hold together. When Jon spends time in the camp, the title starts to make less sense the closer you look at it. King Beyond the Wall sounds like a southern title. It suggests command, hierarchy, something formal. But that's not really what's happening. Mance doesn't sit apart from everyone else. He eats with them, moves through the camp, speaks directly to people without much ceremony. There isn't a court in the way Jon would recognise it. And more importantly, there isn't anything forcing people to stay. No oaths. No punishment system that applies across all groups. If someone decides to leave, they can. You can see that in how the different groups behave. The Thens follow their own structure. Others are much looser. Some treat Mance as a leader, others more as someone worth listening to. It works, but it doesn't look stable. And that seems to be the point. The title isn't about ruling in the southern sense. It's closer to a shared agreement that for now it makes sense to listen to the same person. As long as that holds, the gathering holds. At some point, gathering people isn't enough. You can see that in the way the camp is described. It's large, but it isn't permanent. There's no sense that this is where people intend to stay, and when Jon speaks with Mance, the direction is already clear. South. Not as a raid, at least not in the way the Watch expects. There are too many non-combatants for that. Families, children, older people. They're part of the movement. That changes the scale of what's happening. Mance talks about the wall as a barrier, but also as something that can be crossed. Not easily, but not impossibly either. From the Watcher's perspective, this looks like an invasion forming. From the other side, it comes across more like pressure building toward a single point. If staying where they are no longer works and moving north doesn't solve the problem, then there aren't many directions left. So the gathering turns into movement, and once that starts, everything becomes more fragile. Because keeping people together while they're stationary is one thing, keeping them together while they're all trying to cross the same barrier is something else entirely. When the Night's Watch looks north, what they see is familiar. A large host gathering, weapons, numbers, movement toward the wall. From that perspective, it looks like the beginning of an invasion, and that's how it's treated. Defences are prepared, scouts are sent out. Jon is brought into the conversation because he has seen the camp up close. But Jon's position is awkward, because what he saw doesn't quite match that reading. There are fighters, obviously. But there are also people who have no role in a conventional attack. Wagons, children, older people, entire groups moving together in a way that doesn't fit the pattern of a raid. Even the way the wildlings talk about crossing the wall doesn't sound like conquest. When Jon speaks with Mance, the focus isn't on taking land or defeating the Watch. It keeps circling back to getting through. That difference in interpretation matters, because once both sides act on their own understanding of the situation, there isn't really a way to correct it. The Watch prepares for an attack. The wildlings continue moving toward the only barrier in their path, and by the time those two things meet, it's already too late to reframe what's happening. After the defeat at the wall, Mance Rayder is taken into custody, and the situation changes again. This is where things become less clear. Stannis intends to execute him. There's a public burning. Jon is present for it. The scene is meant to be final. But Melisandre intervenes. What burns is not Mance, but Rattleshirt, altered through glamour. The real Mance is kept alive and hidden. That raises a different kind of question. From this point on, it becomes difficult to separate what Melisandre believes she is directing from what Mance himself is choosing to do. When Jon later speaks with him in A Dance with Dragons, Mance is no longer in a position of open authority. He's being used for a specific purpose, sent to Winterfell under the name Abel, along with a group of spearwives. Melisandre frames this in terms of her visions and the larger war, but Mance doesn't speak like someone who has surrendered his own judgment. The mission itself is focused on rescuing Jane Poole, but it also creates disruption inside Winterfell at a moment when the North is already unstable under Bolton control. So, there are two layers to what's happening. One is Melisandre's intention, using him as part of a larger plan she believes she understands. The other is what Mance actually does once he's inside Winterfell, moving through the castle, working with the spearwives, adapting to a situation that isn't fully under anyone's control. And that leaves open the question of how much of this is direction, and how much is continuation of the same kind of thinking that brought the Free Folk together in the first place. Once Mance reaches Winterfell as Abel, the situation looks very different from anything north of the Wall. There's no open movement here. Everything is contained, watched, tense in a different way. The castle is crowded. Different northern houses are present. Ramsay Bolton holds power, but not in a way that feels stable. There's suspicion everywhere, even before anything begins to go wrong. Mance moves through that carefully. The Spearwives are placed in different roles. They gather information, they wait. And when things begin to shift, missing people, rising tension, confusion inside the castle, it doesn't look like a direct attack. It looks like something loosening. The stated goal is the rescue of Jane Poole, presented as Arya Stark. But the effect goes beyond that. Winterfell becomes less controlled. Trust between the Boltons and their allies starts to weaken. The situation inside the castle becomes harder to manage, and if you place that next to what's happening beyond the wall, it starts to line up in a different way. The Free Folk needed the North to be something other than a closed, unified front under one ruler. If the Boltons hold Winterfell securely, that doesn't change. If Winterfell becomes unstable, the situation south of the wall becomes less predictable. That doesn't mean this was the sole intention behind the mission, but it does mean the outcome fits into a larger pattern, removing barriers, not just physically but politically. By the time Mance is no longer leading openly, the gathering beyond the wall has already begun to break apart. Some groups reach the wall and negotiate with Jon. Others scatter, some never make it south at all, and that's useful to look at, because it shows what depended on him being there and what didn't. The movement itself, people leaving their homes heading south, that continues. The pressure behind it doesn't disappear, but the sense of everyone moving together under one direction doesn't last in the same way. So whatever held that earlier gathering in place wasn't something permanent. It wasn't a system that could run on its own once it was set up. It depended on someone who could move between groups, speak to them in a way they would accept, and keep pointing them toward the same outcome without forcing it. Once that presence is removed, things start to return to how they normally work beyond the wall, groups acting on their own again. But for a period of time, under very specific conditions, that pattern shifted, and that's the part that stands out. Not that the Free Folk followed a king, but that, for a while, enough of them chose to move in the same direction at the same time. If you're interested in The Lord of the Rings or A Song of Ice and Fire, click one of the links on the screen to dive deeper into the lore. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you next time.